London, in the early 1800s, was not yet the shining symbol of empire that textbooks sometimes pretend it was. When you picture it, you might imagine carriages rolling down cobblestone streets, ladies in crinolines, stepping daintily along pavements, gentlemen in stovepipe hats, debating politics by gaslight. But the London you are about to walk through slowly, quietly, as though drifting was not elegant. It was heavy, damp, and sour. It was a city that, before it became modern, nearly suffocated under the weight of its own waste. You might imagine yourself strolling down a narrow street in Southwark or Whitechapel, the kind where the buildings leaned close together, like gossips whispering above your head. The air is thick, not with the scent of smoke or industry, but with something far more persistent: the unmistakable smell of London's sanitation problem. It is the odour of a city that grew too fast, a population that expanded beyond its infrastructure, and a government that didn't yet understand the full danger of what flowed beneath their feet, and often, unfortunately, in the streets themselves. Victorian London was the world's largest city, but its sewage system was a medieval relic. For centuries, Londoners used cesspits, deep holes dug beneath homes and courtyards, where everything from kitchen slop to human waste went to rest. The idea, in theory, was that these pits would absorb liquids, leaving solids to be removed by men known charmingly as night soil collectors. Their job, which you would not envy even in the softest daydream, involved descending into these pits, scraping muck into barrels, lifting it to street level, and carrying it away in the dead of night, so respectable people did not have to witness the process. But as London grew, these cesspits filled too quickly. The groundwater rose, the pits seeped. When households installed new conveniences, like the suddenly fashionable water closet waste, entered the pits in greater volumes than they had ever been designed to contain. People wanted cleaner homes, but the infrastructure to support that cleanliness simply didn't exist. So, the overflow began. You can almost hear it as you walk. A slow drip behind a house wall, a trickling under a floorboard. Waste found its way into cellars, turning them into foul-smelling basins. It seeped under foundations. In poorer neighbourhoods, it rose through floorboards in a brown, viscous tide. Some families slept above a thin plank barrier, separating their beds from a shallow film of sewage pooling beneath them. By the 1840s, the Thames River, London's great artery, had become a wide, slow-moving sewer. It carried the city's waste through its heart, and every tide pushed it back again, leaving behind deposits along the riverbanks, like unwelcome gifts. You might pause on a bridge and look over the railing, not to admire the water, but to watch it move sluggishly, as though reluctant to carry its burden any farther. The river, once a source of life, had become a warning sign, yet few understood what it meant. People in Victorian London did not know about bacteria or viruses. They believed, instead, in miasma, the idea that diseases were spread through bad smells. It was a theory that made intuitive sense. If you lived surrounded by stenches so powerful they made your eyes water, you might also assume that the odour itself was the threat. So officials focused on controlling the smell. They spread lime in the streets. They closed windows. They advised people to inhale vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs. But the true problem, what you and I would recognise instantly today, went unseen. If you walked deeper into the neighbourhoods of Lambeth or Bermondsey during this period, you would notice something else: the stark difference between those who had access to cleaner water and those who did not. Water companies drew their supply directly from the Thames, sometimes upstream, but often not far, from the outflows of sewers. In heavily populated areas, pipes and pumps delivered river water that was cloudy, gritty, and sometimes flecked with particles people preferred not to identify, and people drank it anyway. Because what else was there? Boiling water for daily use required fuel, wood, or coal, both expensive. For the poorest Londoners, the solution was not to purify their water, but simply to endure it. This was a city whose inhabitants developed a tolerance not only for foul air, but for water that carried the seeds of disease with deceptive normalcy. That brings you, quietly and almost inadvertently, to the rise of cholera. Cholera arrived in London like an unnamed shadow in 1831. It struck fast, leaving many confused as to what it even was at first. Within hours of infection, a person could go from apparently healthy to desperately ill, racked by cramps, vomiting uncontrollably, dehydrated to the point where their skin lost its elasticity. Doctors, following the term miasma theory, believed the disease was spread by the foul air rising from the Thames and the streets. They prescribed smelling salts, mustard poultices, and purging medicines. None of these treatments helped. Many made matters worse. As you move through the city in this imagined walk, you might overhear people discussing the illness in hushed tones. A mother might blame the fog rising from the river. A merchant might blame foreign sailors. A vicar might say it is punishment for the city's sins. Few suspected the water. Fewer still understood how sanitation had set the stage for disaster. Meanwhile, the population continued to grow. Immigrants arrived from rural England, from Ireland during the famine years, from across Europe, all seeking work in the bustling metropolis. They crowded into tenements, where toilets were shared among dozens of people, and waste pipes clogged with alarming regularity. When the pipes blocked, the sewage overflowed onto floors, into corridors, into queues, the streets. Children played near puddles of wastewater, their toys floating briefly before sinking beneath the surface. The smell was constant, but the pressing need for survival muted complaints. To live in Victorian London was to accept discomfort as a daily companion. And yet, you might notice something else as you wander through this version of the past. Despite the filth, there was a strange and quiet resilience to the people. They worked in factories and docks, in laundries and breweries, in shops and on the streets, doing whatever they could to carve out modest lives. The city may have been drowning in waste, but it pulsed with human effort all the same. People adapted. They found ways to make do in an environment that most modern readers would find almost unthinkable. Still, the river kept collecting waste. The cesspits kept overflowing. And the belief in miasma, this comforting but incorrect idea, kept officials focused on the wrong solutions. The city could not go on like this forever, but no one yet knew what turning point would force London to confront the truth. If you linger at the edge of the Thames in the late 1840 seconds, you might notice that something about the city is beginning to shift. Not in the air, the smell remains as pungent as ever, nor in the water, which continues its slow, burdened crawl. The shift is happening beneath the surface, in the minds of a few individuals who dared to imagine that London's persistent miseries might have deeper causes than mere foul odours. But progress in Victorian London was never swift, and change rarely arrived gracefully. Instead, it crept forward the way the river's tide crept along the muddy embankments, hesitant, reluctant, but determined. At the heart of this shift was the unsettling pattern of cholera outbreaks that seemed to strike London every few years. You might picture a map spread across a wooden table in a dimly lit room, squares of coloured pins marking neighbourhoods where the disease appeared with particular ferocity. In areas where cesspits overflowed most disastrously, the pins clustered like a disturbing rash. Yet city officials, guided by the miasma theory, did not notice the pattern. They saw the pins, they acknowledged the deaths, but their ideas about disease blinded them to any interpretation that contradicted their assumptions. It was into this world that a physician named John Snow stepped with quiet determination. Snow was not a dramatic figure. He wasn't the sort of person who delivered stirring speeches or demanded attention. You might imagine him instead as a thoughtful man with sharp eyes and a reserved manner, spending long hours walking through London's streets, observing details that others overlooked. He treated patients, listened to their stories, and collected information in notebooks with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. Snow suspected that cholera did not originate in the air, but in the water. It was an idea that, in the early 1850s, verged on heresy. To believe it was to challenge not only established medical theory, but also the pride of London's governing bodies. Yet Snow's reasoning was simple. Cholera struck the digestive system. Its symptoms matched what one might expect from ingesting something harmful, not inhaling it. And its outbreaks often followed water sources rather than wind patterns. So Snow began to investigate. You might walk beside him in your imagination, following his steps as he visited households struck by cholera. He asked questions no one else thought to ask. Where did families get their water? Which pump did they use? Did they boil it, filter it, or drink it raw from the spout? He took samples. He drew rough sketches of neighborhoods. He created charts and diagrams with the patient persistence of someone who believed that the truth, even a boring truth, was worth uncovering. But Snow's early warnings went largely ignored. Officials were more concerned with combating the smells that offended upper-class sensibilities than with studying the water systems that affected everyone. Parliament discussed the stench. Newspapers complained about it. Homeowners demanded relief. But the deeper cause, the contamination of drinking water with human waste, remained unaddressed. Meanwhile, the city kept changing. With each passing year, more people poured into London, and the cracks in its infrastructure widened just a little more. New houses rose quickly, sometimes without proper connections to drainage systems. Old sewers collapsed. Makeshift pipes were added wherever they could fit, often leading straight into the Thames. The river became not merely polluted, but genuinely dangerous. If you took a ferry across it during the summer, your eyes might water from the intensity of the smell. Passengers sometimes complained of headaches and nausea. Children held their noses or buried their faces in their parents' coats. But none of these reactions sparked the systemic reform the city desperately needed. Change finally arrived in a dramatic, almost absurd way, in the form of the Great Stink of 1858. Imagine yourself standing on the embankment during that blistering summer. London was experiencing a heat wave, and the river's already foul waters began to heat and ferment. The odor intensified until it felt like a tangible force pressing against the city. Newspapers described it as unbearable. Residents fled from river-adjacent neighborhoods if they could. Curtains were soaked in chloride solutions in desperate attempts to purify the air. Inside the newly built Houses of Parliament, situated inconveniently close to the river, the stench was so overwhelming that lawmakers soaked their window drapes in heavy chemicals and still struggled to work. There are stories of meetings being cut short because members refused to remain in the chamber. The stench, more than cholera or overflowing cesspits, or the suffering of the poor, finally forced Parliament to acknowledge the severity of London's sanitation crisis. You might pause here to appreciate the irony. After years of devastating epidemics and countless overflowing cesspits, it was the smell, not the deaths, that moved politicians to action. In the aftermath of the Great Stink, public pressure mounted. Citizens wrote letters to newspapers. Merchants complained about disrupted business. Clergy petitioned for moral cleanliness. And finally, reluctantly, Parliament was compelled to consider the possibility that perhaps London's aging sanitation system could no longer support its millions of inhabitants. This is where Joseph Bazalgette enters the story. If Snow was the quiet investigator who unraveled cholera's mystery, Bazalgette was the ambitious engineer who confronted the problem at its most fundamental level. You might imagine him poring over maps of London, calculating gradients and pipe capacities, planning a system that would not only remove waste, but prevent it from ever returning to the city's drinking water. Bazalgette believed that London needed an entirely new sewer system, one that would intercept the old, failing drains and transport sewage far downriver, away from the city's water supply. His design included brick-lined tunnels, wide enough for a man to walk through, massive pumping stations powered by steam engines, and a network so extensive that parts of it would still be in use more than a century later. But in the mid-19th century, his vision was considered radical. The cost alone was enough to frighten many members of Parliament. To build the system would require not just money, but a level of administrative coordination rarely attempted in Victorian infrastructure projects. Yet the Great Stink had softened resistance. Members of Parliament had personally experienced the consequences of inaction, and the stench had left a memory not easily dismissed. So, with some hesitation, they approved Bazalgette's plan. Construction began soon after. If you imagine yourself standing at one of the work sites in the early 1860s, you would see a scene both orderly and chaotic. Hundreds of labourers moved earth with shovels and picks. Steam cranes lifted materials. Horse-drawn carts carried brick after brick to the construction trenches. Engineers checked measurements with careful precision, ensuring that each pipe would descend at the correct slope for gravity to draw the wastewater away. It was a project measured not in days but in years, years of mud, noise, accidents, and progress. Bazalgette himself insisted on building the sewers larger than necessary, predicting that London's population would continue to grow. His foresight, almost boring in its practicality, would later prove essential for the city's future. Meanwhile, John Snow continued his work, though he would not live to see the full triumph of his theory. His famous investigation of the Broad Street pump, perhaps the most iconic moment in public health history, occurred in 1854. During one of London's most concentrated cholera outbreaks, Snow mapped cholera cases around the Soho neighbourhood, identifying a startling cluster around the pump. When he had its handle removed, the outbreak quickly subsided. Though officials initially dismissed Snow's findings, the Broad Street map would become a cornerstone of epidemiology, a quiet revolution born from the careful observation of everyday patterns. As Bazalgette's sewers expanded and Snow's ideas gained traction, a new understanding slowly took hold among London's population. Water had become the enemy, not air. Cleanliness was not merely a matter of deodorizing the streets, but of protecting the sources of drinking water. Gradually, these ideas coalesced into public health policies that reshaped the city. Still, despite all this progress, London's transformation was not immediate. Cholera outbreaks continued for some years. Construction delays slowed the sewer system's completion, and many Londoners accustomed to their old habits took time to adapt to new infrastructure. But beneath the noise and activity, another quiet change was taking place. London was beginning to separate itself from its own waste. It was a subtle shift, but profound. No longer would sewage seep beneath floorboards or rise through cellar walls. No longer would pumps draw water tainted with runoff from cesspits. No longer would the Thames function as the city's open sewer. By the mid-1860s, London was no longer simply a city struggling with its own filth. It was a laboratory of urban transformation. What you witness now is a city still bustling, still crowded, but slowly beginning to breathe in ways it had not for decades. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers were under construction, vast tunnels stretching beneath the streets like hidden rivers. These were not merely functional, they were an assertion that human ingenuity could bend nature's hazards to practical ends, even in a city as dense and historically chaotic as London. Walking through the construction sites or imagining yourself doing so, you would see labourers in muddy boots, faces darkened with soot and grime, moving bricks and stones with tireless persistence. Steam pumps hissed and groaned, lowering groundwater so that the masonry could be laid in a dry trench. It was a repetitive, almost hypnotic work, the kind of steady effort that rarely attracts attention in history books. Yet it was precisely this discipline that saved countless lives. Every brick, every bend in the pipe, every labourer's shovel contributed to a monumental shift in the relationship between human habitation and sanitation. Meanwhile, the memory of the Broad Street cholera outbreak still lingered in public consciousness. John Snow's methodical mapping of cases was slowly vindicated, though he had died in 1858, the year of the Great Stink. His work lived on as an essential demonstration of how careful observation and logical reasoning could reveal the hidden patterns of disease. Doctors and public health officials began to recognize that waterborne pathogens, not foul air, were the real culprits. It was a revolution of perception, invisible in the streets, yet transformational in its consequences. As Bazalgette's sewer system began to connect districts that had previously relied on failing cesspits, water quality slowly improved. Areas previously plagued with periodic cholera outbreaks saw declines in cases. The Thames, once a river of waste, started to carry the promise of a cleaner city. Bathing became less hazardous. Water drawn from pumps and reservoirs became safer to drink. People gradually understood that sanitation was not merely a matter of comfort or aesthetics, it was life and death. The seemingly mundane act of transporting waste away from homes had become a lifeline for millions. Yet, if you drift through London's streets in your imagination, you would notice that this transition was neither neat nor immediate. Families still relied on old habits. Not all homes were connected to the new sewers. The poorest neighborhoods lagged behind, often unable to access the modern conveniences that wealthier districts enjoyed. Cholera outbreaks did not vanish instantly. Snow's evidence, while compelling, had taken years to influence policy. And the implementation of Bazalgette's engineering marvel was measured in decades rather than months. Progress was slow, but deliberate, like water carving channels through stone. The story of Victorian sanitation teaches you something subtle about human societies. Disasters often force change, but only when they become impossible to ignore. The repeated waves of cholera, while deadly, had not been sufficient to compel action. It was the Great Stink, a sensory experience so intolerable that it penetrated the walls of power, that finally spurred legislation and massive infrastructure investment. This highlights a pattern in human history. Practical reform often waits for discomfort that can no longer be ignored, rather than being guided purely by logic or morality. By the 1,870 Bazalgette's system was largely complete. More than 1,100 miles of street sewers had been constructed, connecting to 11 major intercepting sewers that channeled waste safely downstream of the city. Pumping stations, designed with mechanical sophistication and foresight, lifted sewage when gravity alone could not suffice. The scale of the work was staggering not just in terms of cost or labor, but in the vision required to anticipate the needs of a growing metropolis. Bazalgette had designed a system robust enough to accommodate a population nearly double that of his time, a design that would still serve parts of London into the 21st century. The transformation was not just infrastructural, it was societal. The understanding that water could carry disease changed daily habits. Middle-class homes installed improved plumbing, and the concept of sanitation began to penetrate public consciousness. Newspapers and pamphlets educated citizens on the importance of clean water, proper waste disposal, and basic hygiene. Public bathhouses proliferated. Regulations around building codes and drainage became stricter. In essence, a city that had teetered on the brink of recurring epidemics was now learning to manage its own survival through a combination of engineering, science, and social adaptation. And yet, there remained a quiet lesson, almost invisible to those who marvel at the engineering alone. London's crisis was not the result of a single catastrophic event. It was the accumulation of countless small failures. Overflowing cesspits, poorly maintained pipes, polluted rivers, and a public health system slow to react. Each of these details, seemingly minor, compounded over decades until the city became a living, breathing hazard. History is often shaped by these mundane, frustratingly ordinary failures, moments and systems that may seem boring at the time, but whose consequences ripple forward in ways few predict. For you, observing this from a historical vantage point, it is impossible not to notice the duality in the story. There is horror in the filth and the suffering of ordinary Londoners, yet there is also awe in the persistence, ingenuity, and gradual triumph of reason over circumstance. Snow's meticulous detective work, Bazalgette's engineering vision, and the eventual adoption of modern sanitation practices collectively illustrate how human societies can emerge from crises not suddenly, not glamorously, but through slow, steady, deliberate effort. As London grew cleaner, life subtly shifted. Children played in streets, no longer coated with sewage. Merchants could transport goods without the constant stench interfering with commerce. Public confidence in infrastructure, while still nascent, laid the foundation for further urban development. And while cholera would reappear in various parts of the world, the lessons learned in Victorian London provided a template for cities across Europe and North America, demonstrating that investment in basic sanitation was not merely a civic nicety, but a matter of survival. Perhaps the most enduring insight, if you step back and consider it quietly, is how closely our comfort, health, and very survival are tied to the unnoticed systems around us. The sewers beneath London's streets, the water that flows into homes, the discipline of engineers and physicians. These were invisible, boring, and often disregarded in their own time, yet they were the forces that kept millions alive. It is a reminder that history is often made not by the battles that dominate headlines or the speeches that echo in halls, but by those tedious, persistent, and quiet labours that ordinary and extraordinary people undertake to maintain the life of a city. And so, as you leave Victorian London behind in your imagination, standing on a newly cleaned embankment, listening to the murmur of the Thames flowing more freely than it has in decades, you may think of ancient Rome as a city of marble palaces, grand temples, triumphal arches, and gladiators spilling onto the sands of the Colosseum. But if you allow yourself to step off the touristic paths, to wander in the quieter spaces where the city's lifeblood once flowed, you begin to notice something far more mundane, and yet profoundly important. Salt, not in the kitchens of patricians, nor as a simple condiment, but as a commodity that underpinned the very survival of the empire. Without salt, Rome could not feed its people, pay its soldiers, or maintain the complex network of cities and roads that made conquest possible. You might imagine yourself in a small port on the Italian coast. Sometime around the 1st century BCE, a dozen wooden boats rock gently at their found, moorings, sails flapping lazily in the wind. In each boat, barrels are stacked high, glinting in the sun, filled with crystallized salt harvested from nearby salt pans. The smell is sharp and briny, not unpleasant, but powerful enough to make your nostrils flare. Labourers heave the barrels onto carts, their hands roughened by constant exposure to salt and rope. The carts trundle along narrow coastal roads toward larger distribution points, following paths that have existed for centuries. These roads, lined with scrub and occasional villas, are quiet. They carry no fanfare. There are no battle cries, no parades of senators or generals. The work is monotonous, repetitive, and entirely essential. Without it, the cities of the empire, from Rome to Carthage to Antioch, would starve. Salt preserves meat, flavors fish, hardens cheese, and stabilizes bread. It keeps armies marching. It maintains trade. It literally shapes the empire, though it does so in silence, hidden beneath the drama of war, conquests, and politics. Salt was such a critical commodity that it became the basis for one of Rome's most famous financial practices, paying soldiers. The word salary itself derives from salarium, originally an allowance given to soldiers to purchase salt. Imagine a legionary trudging across Europe or North Africa, carrying only what he could bear on his back. Among his provisions, he counts a small stipend to ensure access to salt, a substance so vital that it is almost treated as currency. The empire's expansion and maintenance depended not just on war and law, but on the quiet movement of this mineral across mountains, rivers, and deserts. The salt roads themselves are unremarkable to the casual observer. Flat, often dusty paths carved into the earth by centuries of carts and pack animals, they intersect with larger Roman roads, such as the Via Appia or Via Aurelia. Along their length, travelers encounter small settlements, inns, and warehouses where salt is stored before distribution. These towns grow not because of spectacular architecture or political importance, but because they sit on the path of this essential commodity. Life here is steady, repetitive, almost boring. The movement of goods, the counting of barrels, the constant vigilance against theft or spoilage. Yet the stability of these minor centers is what allows the empire to function. Imagine standing at one of these crossroads, watching a caravan of oxen pulling carts weighted with salt. The drivers are silent, occasionally calling to their animals or adjusting ropes. Dust rises from the road, and the sun beats down relentlessly. Each journey is calculated. Too much salt on one cart could crush the axles. Too little, and the supply chain falters. The monotony is punctuated only by small interruptions. A wheel breaking, a minor argument over tolls, a brief stop to rest and water the animals. For the laborers and traders, the day is long. The work dull, but it is indispensable. Salt is harvested along coastlines and in inland lakes. In places like Ostia, close to Rome, shallow pools trap seawater, which is then evaporated by the sun. The crystalline residue is scraped and collected by workers whose schedules are dictated by the slow rhythms of weather and tide. Inland, miners extract rock salt from deposits that have formed over millennia, carrying it to towns connected to the broader network of Roman roads. These extraction and transport processes are slow and methodical, far from the glory of battles or political maneuvers. Yet without them, the empire's machinery would grind to a halt. The quiet labor of the salt trade also reveals the social structure of the empire. Workers are often slaves or indentured laborers, moving under the direction of overseers. Merchants, stationed in towns along the routes, negotiate prices, maintain records, and sometimes engage in bureaucratic wrangling with local authorities. Soldiers patrol the roads to prevent banditry, but their work is more about maintaining order than engaging in combat. The empire's military might, its law, and its governance all depend on the boring logistics of moving salt, the very mundane work that sustains life and power. Yet, despite the monotony, the consequences of failure are stark. Interruptions in salt supply could lead to spoiled meat, which could cause food poisoning or famine. Armies might suffer, unable to preserve provisions for long campaigns. Prices would rise, and citizens in distant provinces could go hungry. The empire's stability, its ability to project power and maintain order, rested on the regular, almost invisible movement of salt along these quiet roads. It is a sobering reminder that even the greatest empires are built not only on the deeds of generals and senators, but also on the unglamorous work of transporting and managing essential resources. The roads themselves bear witness to centuries of this monotonous movement. Stones, worn smooth by the passage of carts, animals, and human feet, tell a story of continuity and repetition. You might follow one of these roads and find remnants of milestones, marking distances, inscriptions, noting repairs, or small shrines, where travelers offered thanks for safe passage. These markers are the only hints that something crucial happens here, day after day, largely unseen and unremarked upon. Alongside the physical infrastructure, the administrative system of Rome monitors and manages salt distribution. Records are kept, tolls are collected, and regulations ensure that supply meets demand. Provincial governors, magistrates, and minor officials oversee the flow, ensuring that salt reaches urban centers, military outposts, and even distant colonies. This bureaucratic attention, dull and detail-oriented though it may seem, is what enables Rome to function as a coherent political entity across thousands of miles of territory. As you imagine the long journeys from coast to city, from mine to marketplace, you realize that salt, though mundane, is a linchpin. Each step in its movement matters. A delayed shipment could ripple outward, affecting markets, armies, and daily life. What seems boring on the surface, the careful counting of barrels, the measured distribution, the constant maintenance of roads and inns is, in fact, the silent pulse that keeps the empire alive. And yet, for all the importance of salt, the stories of the people who moved it, guarded it, and depended upon it are mostly lost. The records focus on totals, on logistical efficiency, on taxation, but rarely on the daily experience of the laborer scraping salt from a pan at dawn, or the caravan driver navigating miles of uneven road under the summer sun. These overlooked details, small, repetitive, and ordinary, reveal a different Rome, one that survives on discipline, endurance, and the slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of tiny, methodical actions. As night falls along the salt roads, lanterns flicker in small inns and settlements. Caravans rest for the night, oxen tethered outside. The smell of brine lingers faintly in the air, a reminder that life depends on the movement of this mineral. Travelers speak quietly, recounting the day's labor, perhaps speculating on markets in Rome or distant provinces. The roads are silent witnesses to the continuity of empire, where daily, boring routines are as essential to survival as any triumph or victory. And yet, as you trace this network of roads in your mind, an unresolved thought emerges. For all their importance, these routes, the laborers, and the salt itself are almost invisible in historical memory, overshadowed by battles, politics, and architecture. How many of the empire's successes were sustained not by conquest, but by the dull, relentless work of moving and managing essential resources like salt? How fragile is any civilization if the quiet mechanisms that sustain it fail? If you step back onto the salt roads in the early morning, before the sun has burned away the coastal mist, you might see the same caravans that have traveled these routes for decades. Oxen plod steadily, their hooves stirring up fine clouds of dust from the worn tracks, while drivers move slowly alongside, calling softly to animals or adjusting rope and harness. The roads themselves are quiet, but alive with the steady rhythm of repetitive labor, the heartbeat of a civilization that has grown dependent on the meticulous transport of an ordinary mineral. What appears mundane on the surface is, in fact, a carefully orchestrated system, invisible to most observers, yet essential for Rome's survival. Salt is not merely moved from place to place, it is managed. Merchants and officials track quantities, balance supply against demand, and ensure that shortages are prevented. A warehouse along the Via Salaria, Rome's most famous salt road, might hold dozens of barrels, each numbered, each logged, each intended for a specific city or military outpost. Here, the repetitive task of counting barrels, checking seals, and confirming records feels boring to anyone who might record it. Yet it is a task that, if neglected, could ripple catastrophically through the empire. One missing shipment could mean spoiled provisions for a legion or rising bread prices in a provincial town. It is in these warehouses that you begin to see the human side of the operation. Workers handle the barrels with care, scraping off salt residues from edges and lids, ensuring the contents remain dry. Their hands are raw, their clothing stiffened by repeated exposure to brine. They talk quietly, often of mundane concerns, the weather, local politics, the slow pace of trade. Their lives are shaped by rhythm and routine, punctuated by minor setbacks such as broken barrels or late deliveries. And yet, their labor underpins the empire itself. Without these ordinary, repetitive actions, Rome's public granaries, markets, and military campaigns would falter. The salt roads are also corridors of surveillance and regulation. Roman officials monitor travel and commerce along these paths, checking for theft, fraud, or corruption. Soldiers patrol strategic stretches, not to wage war, but to protect the flow of essential goods. Even minor disruptions, banditry, a broken bridge, an overloaded cart, can create cascading effects. The empire's dependence on something as seemingly banal as salt reveals an unsettling truth. The durability of great civilizations often rests on small, fragile, and easily overlooked systems. In addition to the practical, salt has a subtle social dimension. Payment in salt, or salarium, was not just compensation, it was a recognition of the mineral's value and its centrality to daily life. Soldiers would occasionally barter salt for other goods, integrating it into local economies in ways that strengthened connections across provinces. Salt became a kind of common denominator, uniting regions with a shared need, even when language, culture, or governance differed. Its importance was so profound that empires would rise and fall depending on their ability to manage its production and distribution efficiently. As Rome expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean, the salt roads grew increasingly interconnected. Inland cities far from the coast depended on networks of rivers, canals, and pack animal trails to receive their supply. Strategic planning was required to ensure that the salt flowed in steady quantities, especially to garrisons stationed on the empire's frontiers. Logistics officers calculated distances, travel times, and storage needs with painstaking precision. Their work was largely invisible to history, yet indispensable. An empire could wage wars and enact decrees, but without reliable salt transport, its soldiers might starve, its populations might grow discontented, and its cities might collapse under the pressure of inadequate food preservation. The process of moving salt is itself a study in patience. Imagine a caravan traveling from the salt pans along the Adriatic coast to Rome. Oxen plod along narrow tracks. Laborers walk beside them to maintain balance, and stops are planned carefully to rest both men and animals. Every delay, muddy roads, swollen rivers, extreme heat has consequences for timing and quality. Salt exposed to moisture can clump or dissolve, reducing its utility. The journey, repetitive as it is, requires constant attention to detail, foresight, and the kind of dull, methodical vigilance that rarely earns accolades but prevents disaster. Even the administration of salt demonstrates a subtle balance between discipline and flexibility. Roman authorities set prices, regulated sales, and occasionally intervened in disputes between merchants. Yet they also understood that the system could not be rigid. Local conditions demanded judgment. A road washed out by heavy rains, a shipment delayed by miscommunication, or a shortage caused by an unexpected surge in demand required adaptation. Maintaining a living system, rather than enforcing strict rules, was what allowed the empire to survive its dependence on such a seemingly ordinary resource. Salt also interacts with culture and ritual in ways that reveal the mundane foundations of power. Religious festivals, market fairs, and public feasts often depended on the preservation of meat or fish, which in turn required salt. Tribunes and magistrates attending these events understood that logistical failures could undermine public perception and political stability. The mundane act of transporting barrels of salt thus had indirect consequences for public morale, governance, and even social cohesion. Traveling along these roads, you might notice the faint traces of inscriptions or milestones. Some mark distances from the capital, others commemorate repairs or donations from wealthy citizens. These seemingly minor details hint at the invisible labor required to maintain infrastructure over long stretches of terrain. The roads themselves, compacted by centuries of wheels and feet, are monuments to endurance and repetition rather than glory. They are the silent testimony to an empire that survived on the uncelebrated work of countless individuals whose names are largely forgotten. The quiet persistence of the salt roads is mirrored in the broader economic system of Rome. Salt trade contributes to taxation, market stability, and urban growth. It sustains industries like cheese-making, fish curing, and bread baking. The interconnectedness of production, transport, and consumption demonstrates a principle that is rarely highlighted in historical narratives. The empire's strength rested not only on military conquest or political legislation, but on the careful, repetitive, and seemingly boring management of resources essential to life itself. And yet, despite the efficiency and foresight embedded in these systems, vulnerabilities remain. Seasonal variations, political unrest, or natural disasters could interrupt supply chains. A single collapsed bridge or damaged shipment could ripple across provinces, affecting both civilian and military populations. Rome's reliance on such a mundane commodity underscores a profound lesson. Even the mightiest empires are fragile in ways that are almost invisible. History is often shaped not by the spectacular, but by the ordinary, by repetitive, uncelebrated work that quietly sustains life and civilization. As the sun sets over the salt pans, you might watch a caravan finally reach its destination in a provincial town. Laborers unload barrels, officials record the shipment, and merchants arrange the salt for distribution. The journey is complete. But tomorrow, the roads will be alive again, with oxen, carts, and repetitive motion. The empire continues to function, quietly dependent on the ongoing rhythm of transport, counting, and vigilance. Each day's labor, boring as it may appear, is what maintains Rome's survival. By the middle of the 1st century CE, the salt roads of Rome had become more than just routes for transporting an essential commodity. They were the invisible arteries of the empire. They ran like quiet veins beneath the grandeur of the city, beneath the triumphal arches and the forums, beneath the bustling markets where senators debated and citizens argued. Without them, Rome's wealth, military, and social order would have been precarious at best. And yet, unlike the famous conquests and dramatic political upheavals that dominate history books, the story of these roads is subtle, almost boring in its repetition, but no less critical. Imagine following a merchant caravan from the salt pans of Ostia, the principal port for Rome's sea-based salt, inland toward the capital, and beyond. Oxen pull carts creaking under the weight of barrels, while drivers walk alongside, monitoring the load. At each stage, the salt is offloaded, recorded, and redistributed. The warehouse managers note the barrels' numbers and destinations, updating ledgers that ensure supply matches demand. The work is unglamorous, unremarkable, and yet entirely necessary. Each day, this routine preserves not just food, but the stability of the empire itself. Rome's reliance on these mundane systems extended to its military. Soldiers stationed along the frontiers in Hispania, Gaul, or Britannia depended on preserved provisions to maintain their health and readiness. Salted meats and fish could last months. Bread, hardened and preserved, would feed men in distant garrisons. The legionaries' survival often hinged on the precise timing and integrity of salt shipments. It is tempting to focus on battles, strategies, and generals' bravery. But without the dull, continuous work of transporting salt, these campaigns could not have been sustained. Economic consequences flowed naturally from the logistics of salt. Towns, along the salt roads, small settlements that might otherwise be forgotten, became nodes of commerce. Hosting markets, inns, and storage facilities, merchants and officials carefully balanced supply and demand, monitored prices, and adjusted for delays or shortages. Even minor interruptions could trigger local shortages, affecting urban centers and rural settlements alike. The empire's economic health depended on the monotonous repetition of these tasks, recording quantities, arranging transport, maintaining roads, and ensuring security. In this sense, boring work became a form of invisible power. Social life, too, was shaped by the salt trade. The mineral facilitated preservation and flavoring, allowing diets to be more diverse and less dependent on immediate harvests. Public feasts, religious rituals, and communal events often relied on salted provisions. Soldiers, paid with salt allowances, engaged in local barter, creating an informal but essential economic network. Salt became a binding agent, both literal and figurative, connecting the empire's vast and culturally diverse territories. Its movement steady, repetitive, and methodical helped maintain cohesion across thousands of miles. Yet, the salt trade also reveals the empire's fragility. Dependence on a single commodity for preservation and military logistics meant that disruption could be catastrophic. Poor harvests, natural disasters, political instability, or blockages along the salt roads could create crises. The meticulous planning and oversight of merchants, magistrates, and military logisticians prevented disaster. But only barely. Rome's strength was built as much on the reliable execution of ordinary tasks as on conquest and diplomacy. In other words, the empire was remarkable not just for what it achieved in battle, but for the invisible, often boring, labor that made survival possible day after day. The human element of this story is easily overlooked. Laborers scraping salt from pans under the sun, caravan drivers enduring long treks over uneven terrain, warehouse managers counting and recording every barrel, soldiers carrying provisions and guarding roads. All these individuals sustained Rome in ways that history rarely credits. Their names are mostly lost, their work deemed mundane. Yet without them, the grandeur of Rome, the triumphs, the architecture, the governance would have been unsustainable. The empire was as much a product of daily, repetitive labor as of extraordinary acts of leadership or courage. Over time, the salt roads evolved alongside the empire. New routes were carved, existing paths maintained, and infrastructure such as bridges, inns, and warehouses expanded to accommodate growing demand. Administrators refined logistics, anticipating seasonal shortages and adjusting allocations. The network became resilient, able to support military campaigns, urban growth, and population movements across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This quiet adaptability illustrates a key principle. Empires are maintained not solely through spectacular events, but through persistent, incremental, and often boring attention to the small details of survival. By the late empire, as Rome faced internal strife and external pressures, the salt roads continued to function. Even as other institutions faltered, the consistency of the supply chain helped delay systemic collapse, allowing cities to feed their populations and armies to remain provisioned. Yet the eventual decline of the empire demonstrates the limits of such logistical systems. When administrative oversight weakened and roads fell into disrepair, even the previously mundane act of transporting salt became precarious, contributing along with myriad other factors to the erosion of imperial stability. It is a reminder that the mundane and the extraordinary are inseparable. Without the former, the latter cannot endure. From your perspective, tracing the salt roads, from the Adriatic coast to Rome and beyond, a quiet lesson emerges. Civilization often relies on invisible networks, maintained through ordinary, repetitive effort. While historians celebrate battles, treaties, and monumental achievements, the survival of societies frequently hinges on the unglamorous labor of logistics, administration, and maintenance. In the case of Rome, these activities revolved around a mineral so ordinary, it is easy to overlook salt, but whose presence, or absence, could determine life, death, and the very continuity of empire. As you leave the imagined caravan behind, stepping away from dusty roads and sun-baked warehouses, one can reflect on the enduring resonance of this story. The salt roads remind us that the grand narratives of history, empires rising and falling, are inseparable from repetitive, often boring work. The quiet persistence of individuals managing the movement of essential resources shapes the course of civilizations in ways that are rarely dramatic but ultimately decisive. The same principle applies today. Societies depend on the steady, often invisible rhythms of infrastructure, supply chains, and logistics. When you imagine the Ming dynasty, you might picture the Forbidden City rising in majestic layers, its red walls and golden roofs gleaming under the sun. You might imagine emperors in flowing robes, mandarins issuing edicts, and vast armies defending the empire's borders. But behind the grandeur, behind the pageantry and power, there existed another force, far less dramatic, almost boring, yet just as essential. Paperwork. Endless, meticulous paperwork. Imperial orders, tax records, census forms, grain receipts, military reports, and legal documents. The Ming dynasty was held together, not solely by armies or architecture, but by the quiet, tireless work of record-keeping. Imagine yourself stepping into the halls of the Ming bureaucracy in the early 15th century. The air is scented faintly with ink and paper, and sunlight filters through latticed windows onto long tables crowded with stacks of forms. Clerks sit on low stools, carefully transcribing numbers and copying official decrees. Brushes scratch against rice paper with a rhythmic precision, leaving behind characters that must be exact. Mistakes could lead to famine, misallocation of troops, or legal chaos. In this environment, boredom is not incidental, it is a feature. Only repetitive attention to detail can ensure the machinery of empire continues to function. The scope of the paperwork is staggering. The Ming dynasty, ruling from 1368 to 1644, governed hundreds of millions of people across a vast territory. To maintain order, officials conducted regular censuses, recording everything from family structures and land ownership to livestock counts. These censuses were not casual surveys. They were comprehensive, painstaking exercises designed to make the state legible to the emperor. The information collected allowed the consensus government to levy taxes, conscript soldiers, and distribute grain. Without accurate paperwork, the Ming state would collapse under its own complexity. Step into one of the provincial offices, and you would see clerks balancing large ledgers. They cross-check names against registers, calculate land productivity, and annotate discrepancies with red ink. Mistakes were not merely inconvenient, they could have profound consequences. If taxes were misallocated, a district could starve. If military conscription lists were incomplete, frontier defenses might falter. The empire's survival depended upon the consistent, repetitive, and often tedious labor of these anonymous scribes. Beyond administration, paperwork played a central role in economic management. Grain, the lifeblood of the empire, was tracked with scrupulous precision. The government maintained vast granaries to stabilize prices, prevent famine, and provision the military. Officials recorded each shipment, noting its origin, quantity, and intended destination. Caravans carrying grain traveled along routes, crisscrossing rivers, roads, and mountains. At each stop, clerks compared ledgers with actual shipments. These records ensured that local officials could not divert resources for personal gain, and that imperial edicts reached even the most remote villages. In other words, bureaucracy itself became a mechanism of survival. Even daily life in Ming China was intertwined with paperwork. Households were documented, taxes were assessed, and legal disputes were mediated through written records. When a farmer or merchant entered an office, he often faced a clerk who would measure, record, and file every detail of his case. Disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, or local commerce were resolved through a system that valued the consistency and accuracy of documentation over rhetoric or persuasion. Bureaucracy, in its dullness, ensured fairness, or at least predictability. Paperwork also reinforced the cultural and symbolic authority of the emperor. Every document bore seals, titles, and signatures that verified its legitimacy. To the average person, these documents may have seemed mundane, even tiresome, but they were tangible proof of imperial oversight. In a vast empire where distance separated governors from the throne by hundreds or even thousands of miles, the written word was a connective tissue, a way to make authority present in places where no official could physically stand. Paper, ink, and meticulous repetition became as powerful as armies or walls. The production of paper itself was a critical, labor-intensive process. Bamboo, mulberry, and other plant fibers were harvested, boiled, pounded, and pressed into sheets suitable for official use. Workshops buzzed with repetitive activity. Workers dipped brushes, pressed fibers, and dried sheets carefully. The quality of this paper mattered. Tears, smudges, or inconsistencies could compromise a document's usefulness. In sense, every sheet of paper represented countless hours of labor, a hidden infrastructure supporting the empire's administration. The emperor's power, no matter how grand in appearance, rested on these small, repetitive acts. Even communication across the empire relied on paperwork. Orders from the capital were transmitted via couriers carrying official edicts. Each edict was copied meticulously at local offices, then forwarded to subordinate regions. This process could take weeks, yet the repetition of transcription, verification, and delivery ensured that the state maintained control. Without the patient, boring diligence of clerks and couriers, the emperor's commands would be lost in a sea of unrecorded messages and local improvisation. The monotony of this system was, paradoxically, its strength. By standardizing record-keeping, the Ming dynasty created predictability in an otherwise vast and complex society. Officials knew what to expect. Peasants and merchants understood the rules, and the state could intervene when necessary. Repetition, regularity, and diligence, all qualities that might appear dull to an outsider, were essential to the functioning of a civilization covering millions of square kilometers. The empire thrived not through grand gestures alone, but through the quiet, almost invisible labor of bureaucracy. The work of these clerks also preserved history. Census records, tax documents, and edicts provide modern historians with insight into population distributions, economic activity, and administrative priorities. Without the repetitive, tedious labor of countless individuals, we would know far less about how the Ming dynasty functioned. In this sense, the boring work of paperwork has outlived grand palaces and dynastic politics, offering a bridge across centuries to the lives of ordinary people and the mechanisms of governance. Yet, despite the careful design of the bureaucratic machinery, vulnerabilities existed. Clerks could err, records could be lost to fire or flood, and corruption could undermine accuracy. Mistakes in paperwork could ripple outward. Misallocated grain could result in famine. Flawed census counts could skew taxation, and improperly recorded conscription lists could weaken military readiness. The Ming dynasty was stable, but only because these repetitive systems were maintained with almost religious diligence. The moment that diligence faltered, chaos loomed. Even as you imagine the rhythm of this work, the scratch of the brush on paper, the shuffling of ledgers, the faint scent of ink and fiber, you realize that what may seem boring at first glance is, in fact, profoundly consequential. The empire depended on the persistence of these repetitive tasks, on the patience of individuals who likely went unnoticed in their lifetimes, and on the quiet enforcement of standards that ensured the machinery of state functioned across space and time. The seemingly dull labor of paperwork was, paradoxically, the lifeblood of Ming governance. And yet, as meticulous as the system was, it also raises a quiet, unsettling question. For all the time and effort invested in record-keeping, how fragile is an empire that relies so heavily on repetitive, human labor? One misplaced ledger, one miscounted tax, one overlooked edict could have far-reaching consequences. How much of the Ming dynasty's apparent stability rested on these boring, unseen practices? And how close was it to unraveling in moments that no one recorded? As the Ming dynasty entered the 15th century, the sheer scale of its administration became increasingly apparent. Imagine the provincial offices in Jiangnan or Sichuan, where clerks sit shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, the faint scent of ink filling the air. Each clerk bends over ledgers filled with rows of meticulously drawn characters. Every stroke of the brush matters. A misplaced number could misallocate grain, overtax a family, or leave a border, garrison, under-provisioned. The work is repetitive, almost hypnotic, and yet it sustains life across millions of square kilometers. Here, the empire exists not in grand architecture or conquests, but in the repetitive, boring rhythm of record-keeping. The movement of grain provides a clear illustration of how paperwork underpinned survival. The Ming government maintained massive granaries in strategic locations, often near rivers or major trade routes. Grain collected as tax or tribute was catalogued carefully. Quantity, quality, origin, and storage location were recorded in multiple registers. Couriers carried these records to the central government in Nanjing or Beijing, where officials cross-referenced them against local reports. Delays, errors, or theft could compromise food security, so clerks double-checked every line, every figure, every annotation. What seems like mundane bureaucratic diligence is, in fact, the difference between famine and sustenance for millions. Transportation added another layer of complexity. Barges and carts moved grain along rivers, canals, and roads. At every checkpoint, the clerks verified shipments, recorded their arrival, and adjusted ledgers. This verification process was repetitive and time-consuming, but essential. It prevented embezzlement, avoided duplication, and ensured that provincial officials could not divert resources. You can almost hear the rhythmic stamping of seals, the soft scratch of brushes, the low murmur of clerks confirming numbers. The machinery of empire functions in these quiet moments, invisible to the outside observer. The administrative rigor extended beyond grain and taxes to military logistics. Border regions faced persistent threats from Mongol incursions, pirate raids, and rebellions. Troops relied on precise conscription lists, provisioning records, and supply schedules. Clerks tracked every soldier, name, age, hometown, assignment, and equipment. Food, weapons, and uniforms were logged meticulously. One slip in paperwork could leave a garrison vulnerable or disrupt a campaign hundreds of miles away. In this sense, boring paperwork was a tool of survival, a silent guardian of the empire's territorial integrity. Local governance also depended heavily on documentation. Magistrates in towns and counties issued permits, adjudicated disputes, and collected taxes using official forms. Land surveys were updated regularly to reflect transfers, inheritance, or disputes. Legal cases generated multiple copies of petitions, judgments, and appeals. Officials spent long days reading, writing, and verifying documents, ensuring that each action conformed to imperial law. To an outsider, the process appears monotonous, even tedious. Yet, it is exactly this discipline that prevents chaos in a society of millions. The production and distribution of paper itself was a massive undertaking. Workshops employed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers who prepared fibers, pressed sheets, and stored finished paper for bureaucratic use. Quality control was essential. Thin or brittle sheets could tear during copying, smudging the official record. The durability of the empire relied on these behind-the-scenes tasks. One damaged ledger in a provincial office could disrupt tax collection, military provisioning, or legal adjudication. In other words, survival hinged on the monotonous labor of those who never appeared in grand histories. Beyond administration and logistics, paperwork carried symbolic weight. Imperial decrees were often displayed publicly, bearing seals and signatures that signified authority. Citizens, officials, and soldiers recognized these documents as extensions of the emperor's will. Even if few could read them, their presence reinforced the legitimacy of governance. Paper, ink, and repetition became instruments of control, ensuring that the vast Ming bureaucracy operated coherently despite the empire's immense size and diversity. Authority flowed through the meticulous replication and transmission of written records, a system as methodical as it was unglamorous. Bureaucracy also required constant monitoring, and correction. Audits, inspections, and reviews were routine. Officials traveled to provinces to verify records against reality, comparing census data, tax receipts, and granary inventories. Errors were corrected, discrepancies explained, and negligence punished. This cycle of review and repetition, while tiresome, provided stability and accountability. Without it, local officials could exploit gaps, embezzle resources, or misreport critical data, undermining imperial authority. The boring work of oversight was a keystone of governance. Cultural norms reinforced this bureaucratic discipline. Education for clerks emphasized calligraphy, accuracy, and methodical thinking. Civil service examinations tested candidates not only on literary knowledge, but on their ability to maintain precise records and apply regulations consistently. The system rewarded patience and attention to detail, qualities that historians might dismiss as mundane, but which were essential for the functioning of an empire managing millions of people and vast territories. Yet, even the most disciplined system could not anticipate every challenge. Natural disasters, rebellions, or sudden demographic shifts required rapid adjustment. Officials relied on redundancy in paperwork, multiple copies, cross-checks, and hierarchical reporting to maintain resilience. This approach minimized the risk of systemic collapse, ensuring that even if one office faltered, the empire could continue to function. Again, the strength of the Ming dynasty lay not in heroic deeds or military genius alone, but in the consistent execution of repetitive, often boring tasks. The consequences of failure were immediate and tangible. Mismanaged grain shipments could cause famine. Inaccurate census counts could overburden some districts while undertaxing others. Misfiled conscription lists could weaken defenses. In this sense, paperwork was not just bureaucratic formality, it was the thin line between stability and crisis. The very survival of the Ming state depended on the repetitive diligence of clerks, scribes, and administrators, whose labor was invisible to most contemporaries but vital in retrospect. As you imagine the long days in provincial offices, the scratching of brushes, the careful checking of numbers, you begin to see the empire not as a collection of monumental architecture or dramatic battles, but as a vast system of human effort organized around repetition, verification, and precision. The Ming dynasty's achievements, the wealth, stability, and cultural flourishing often celebrated in histories, were grounded in these ordinary acts. Bureaucratic diligence is as much a story of human endurance and ingenuity as any conquest or diplomatic victory. And yet, despite the sophistication and rigor of the system, a quiet question lingers. How fragile is an empire that relies so heavily on repetitive human labor? Could a clerical error, a misfiled ledger, or a disrupted supply chain trigger cascading failures across provinces? How close was the stability of the Ming dynasty to unraveling in moments that no one recorded, moments so ordinary that they appear invisible to history? By the late 15th century, the Ming dynasty's bureaucratic machinery had matured into an intricate, vast, and almost invisible network. You can imagine the imperial capital, Beijing, teeming not only with soldiers and courtiers, but with clerks, scribes, and low-ranking officials whose lives revolved around the movement, verification, and recording of information. In the hallways of provincial offices, in granaries, tax bureaus, and military posts, paperwork hummed like a quiet current beneath the surface of the empire, holding together the immense, sprawling society of hundreds of millions of people. The survival and relative stability of the Ming state were directly linked to this invisible infrastructure. Grain shipments arrived on time, conscription lists were accurate, and tax revenues reached the central treasury. Clerks meticulously recorded the ebb and flow of goods, population, and military resources, ensuring that even the most remote province remained connected to imperial oversight. While generals won victories and emperors issued decrees, it was the painstaking work of repetition, counting, recording, reviewing, and correcting that made it possible for these achievements to have lasting effect. In many ways, the bureaucracy functioned like the circulatory system of a living organism. Each piece of paper, each recorded number, acted as a cell carrying vital information through the veins of the state. If an office failed to record a shipment, or a clerk misplaced a ledger, the consequences could spread like a fever. A garrison might lack food, a district might be overtaxed, or a famine could be exacerbated by inaccurate grain accounts. The empire's grandeur, in this sense, depended on what might appear boring, mundane, or trivial. The difference between survival and crisis often lay in the steady, repetitive labor of ordinary individuals. Travelers moving along river routes or mountain passes might never see the scribes at work, yet they relied on their diligence. Merchants, peasants, and soldiers depended on the accurate administration of resources. Even the emperor, seated in his palace, depended upon reports, ledgers, and petitions delivered by couriers and meticulously verified by subordinates. Bureaucracy thus became both a practical and symbolic mechanism. Practical in sustaining life and order, symbolic in asserting the authority of the throne across vast distances. This invisible system also shaped culture and daily life. Households were aware that their names were recorded, their taxes documented, and their legal disputes logged. Merchants planned their trade around the rhythms of collection and reporting. Grain reserves allowed urban centers to thrive, even in years of poor harvest. Military campaigns could proceed with the confidence that provisions and reinforcements were accounted for. Repetition, order, and diligence, qualities that seem mundane, were the very backbone of Ming civilization. Yet, the story of the paperwork also highlights the fragility of even the most sophisticated systems. Clerical errors, lost documents, or localized corruption could ripple outward. A miscounted census might lead to overtaxation or conscription errors. A misfiled granary record could result in shortages. A delayed edict could sow confusion in distant provinces. The empire's resilience relied on redundancy, checks, and layers of verification. Every repetitive act, every seemingly boring entry, contributed to systemic stability. And history, in turn, remembers the empire's endurance as a product not just of conquests or architecture, but of invisible, methodical labor. The cultural dimension of bureaucracy was no less significant. Civil service examinations trained clerks to value accuracy, patience, and consistency. Seals, stamps, and meticulous script conveyed legitimacy and authority. The population, aware of this documentation, interacted with the state in predictable ways. They complied with tax obligations, presented petitions in proper form, and accepted legal judgments backed by written records. Paperwork thus shaped behavior and expectations across the empire, embedding order into everyday life without the need for constant physical enforcement. By the 16th century, Ming administrative practices had become models of bureaucratic sophistication. Provincial offices operated with remarkable efficiency. Granaries were stocked and monitored, and military conscription followed detailed protocols. Repetition and diligence created a resilient, if painstakingly slow, administrative machine. The empire survived famines, rebellions, and external threats, in large part because of these unseen systems. Its continuity was rooted not in the spectacular, but in the steady pulse of clerks, scribes, and low-level officials performing their daily, repetitive tasks with meticulous attention. From your vantage point, observing these invisible mechanisms, one can see the paradox at the heart of the Ming dynasty. Its might, wealth, and stability relied less on dramatic feats of arms or grand architectural projects, and more on the quiet, repetitive, and often boring work of record-keeping. Civilization, in this view, is not built only on glory or spectacle, but on invisible infrastructures maintained by persistence, discipline, and ordinary human diligence. Even today, the lessons of the Ming bureaucracy resonate. Modern societies depend on similar invisible networks: census bureaus, tax offices, supply chains, record-keeping systems, whose operation is rarely celebrated but essential for survival. The Ming experience demonstrates that human civilization is fragile in ways that are often invisible. A single broken link in a network of repetition and record-keeping can have consequences far beyond what any individual might imagine. As the sun sets over a provincial office in Ming China, the clerks finally stretch their tired hands and straighten their ledgers. The stacks of paper, meticulously arranged, are both ordinary and extraordinary. They represent the lives of millions, the survival of the state, and the quiet power of repetition. Through their labor, the empire persists, even when armies falter or floods devastate fields. And in the stillness, as lanterns. When you think of early hospitals, you might imagine cold stone buildings, the wail of patients, and physicians in robes examining the sick. What you may not imagine is the presence of a heavy, silvery metal quietly shaping the course of medical practice: mercury. Today, mercury is largely viewed with suspicion. Its toxicity, environmental hazards, and neurological effects are well known. But from the 16th century through the 19th century, mercury was a cornerstone of medicine. It was boring in its monotony, repetitive in its applications, and surprisingly central to the functioning of early hospitals. Without it, many of the systems we now take for granted in modern medicine may have developed very differently. Picture a typical European hospital, around 1,600. The walls are bare stone, occasionally warmed by small hearths. The smell is a mix of herbs, sweat, and disinfectants, though these are primitive by modern standards. In one corner, a tray of small, heavy containers sits neatly arranged. Each contains mercury, carefully measured and ready for use. The physician or surgeon, sometimes one and the same, is methodical, almost ritualistic, in his application. Mercury is incorporated into ointments, pills, and topical solutions. Its use is unglamorous and repetitive, often dull to observe. Yet its significance cannot be overstated. It represents one of the few tools available to treat persistent diseases. Most notoriously, syphilis. Syphilis, emerging in Europe at the end of the 15th century, became a public health crisis. Without antibiotics, physicians relied on mercury to treat the disease. Despite its toxicity, patients were given mercury ointments, sometimes applied externally over weeks or months, or orally through pills. The process was tedious, slow, and required careful monitoring. Too much mercury could poison the patient. Too little, and the disease persisted. Doctors and nurses engaged in repetitive routines of administration, observation, and adjustment. The work was dull, sometimes unpleasant, but crucial to the survival of both patient and institution. Mercury became the backbone of early therapeutic practice, a dull invention that shaped hospital procedures for centuries. Hospitals themselves depended on the predictable, standardized use of mercury. Apothecaries prepared the metal carefully, ensuring correct doses and consistency. Clerks recorded inventories, tracking shipments and usage. Physicians noted patients' responses in meticulous ledgers. Every application followed a prescribed regimen, with frequent repetition. This procedural monotony may seem boring to a modern observer, but in practice, it allowed early hospitals to function as centers of systematic care rather than chaotic collections of ailing individuals. The regularity of treatment protocols, anchored by mercury, provided a foundation for institutional medicine. The administration of mercury was not without ritual. Physicians and nurses wore aprons and gloves, not just for hygiene, but to avoid prolonged exposure. They washed hands and tools carefully between applications, recording doses and outcomes. Each step was repeated countless times a day. Patients received mercury in intervals, often under observation for weeks. This painstaking, repetitive, work ensured that the hospital could treat many patients simultaneously while minimizing catastrophic mistakes. It is a reminder that the dullest aspects of practice, measuring, observing, repeating, often have profound consequences for health and survival. The production of mercury itself was a specialized, repetitive process. Extracted from cinnabar in controlled heating chambers, mercury required careful handling to avoid loss or contamination. Apothecaries mastered the extraction, storage, and formulation of mercury into ointments, pills, and solutions. Every batch was catalogued, weighed, and labeled. Hospitals depended on this supply chain, and any disruption could halt treatment. This behind-the-scenes work, repetitive and largely invisible, demonstrates how an ordinary substance became indispensable to institutional medicine. Mercury's dull significance extends beyond individual treatment. In hospitals, it dictated the organization of space and labor. Patients undergoing mercury therapy were often isolated to prevent contamination or manage side effects. Nursing routines revolved around administering doses, monitoring reactions, and recording outcomes. Clerks and apothecaries kept inventories and prepared daily supplies. The institution ran on a rhythm defined by this mundane, repetitive process. Success did not come from dramatic interventions, but from consistency, diligence, and procedural discipline. Even societal understanding of disease was shaped by mercury. Physicians debated its efficacy, adjusted doses based on observed outcomes, and recorded cases meticulously. Knowledge accumulated slowly, one repetitive application after another. Each patient represented a single iteration in a long experiment, and the sum of countless boring procedures built the foundation of early modern medicine. Mercury therapy, dull and repetitive though it may have seemed, created a framework for observation, documentation, and standardization that persists in hospitals today. Mercury also shaped hospital economics and logistics. It was heavy, expensive, and required careful storage. Hospitals maintained inventories, recorded expenditures, and rationed usage. Disruption in supply could compromise treatment regimens. Clerks, physicians, and apothecaries collaborated in a boring, repetitive, administrative network to ensure that the metal, its forms, and its dosages were available when needed. This logistical backbone, mundane as it seems, was critical to the functioning of early healthcare institutions. And yet, despite its centrality, mercury was hazardous. Overexposure caused tremors, neurological damage, and sometimes death. The dull labor of handling, measuring, and applying it carried inherent risk. Physicians accepted these dangers because there were few alternatives. The monotony of careful application, however, reduced risk and ensured that hospitals could treat larger numbers of patients over time. Here again, the boring, methodical approach was both protective and enabling, allowing the institution to function sustainably. Even in the modern imagination, it is easy to overlook the significance of this mundane metal. Mercury does not inspire drama, heroism, or grandeur. It is heavy, silvery, toxic, repetitive. Yet early hospitals relied upon it to organize care, standardize treatment, and manage patient populations. Its dullness was, paradoxically, its strength. It provided a predictable, repeatable process upon which medical practice could build. In the quiet application of mercury, in the repetitive rhythms of apothecaries and nurses, hospitals began to emerge as institutions rather than simply refuges for the sick. As hospitals in Europe and later in colonial outposts began to standardize care during the 17th and 18th centuries, mercury remained a central, if monotonous, component of medical treatment. Imagine a hospital in Paris or London, where wards are filled with patients suffering from syphilis, skin disorders, or other chronic conditions. In these wards, the rhythm of daily life is dictated less by dramatic interventions than by repetitive, carefully calibrated procedures. Nurses and physicians administer mercury in precise doses, monitor patient responses, and record outcomes. The work is painstaking, methodical, and seemingly boring. Yet it is through this repetition that care is sustained across the institution. The administration of mercury required a keen understanding of dosage, timing, and patient tolerance. A single misstep, too much mercury, too frequent application, or prolonged exposure could result in severe toxicity, including tremors, excessive salivation, kidney damage, or death. Physicians developed systematic protocols to manage these risks. Patients were bathed in mercurial ointments, sometimes daily, for weeks or months. Pills containing mercury were administered orally, often requiring careful observation and adjustment. The monotony of this practice ensured that the dangerous substance was applied safely and that treatment could be scaled across the hospital's population. Hospitals relied on the meticulous recording of every patient's interaction with mercury. Ledger after ledger documented doses, symptoms, responses, and adjustments. Clerks, scribes, and assistants transcribed these notes into central records, creating a database of treatment experiences that spanned years. Each entry was repetitive: patient name, condition, treatment method, dosage, outcome. To modernize, this documentation may seem tedious or dull, but it formed the empirical foundation for understanding mercury therapy and, by extension, the principles of systematic medical practice. The accumulation of small, repetitive data points created knowledge over time, laying the groundwork for more sophisticated interventions in the centuries to come. The logistics of mercury in hospitals were equally repetitive and methodical. Apothecaries prepared ointments, pills, and topical solutions daily, carefully measuring the heavy metal into precise quantities. Each batch was tested, weighed, labeled, and stored in designated containers. Inventory management was essential. Overuse or misplacement could disrupt treatment schedules and compromise patient care. The repetitive labor of apothecaries and clerks, often conducted in silence, ensured that hospitals operated reliably. In this way, the dullness of routine was not a limitation, but a form of institutional resilience. Beyond logistics, mercury therapy shaped the organization of hospital spaces. Patients receiving treatment were often grouped into dedicated wards or sections to manage side effects and ensure careful observation. Nurses followed rigid schedules, applying ointments, administering pills, and recording reactions multiple times a day. Even minor adjustments, an extra dose, a delayed application, or additional observation were noted meticulously. This regimented routine allowed hospitals to function efficiently despite the toxic nature of the substance and the limited medical knowledge of the time. The repetitive nature of mercury therapy also influenced social and cultural aspects of medicine. Families visiting patients, physicians training apprentices, and even local communities learned to understand medical care as a structured, procedural activity. The expectation of regular, repeated applications of treatment became a norm. Mercury, dull though it may seem, taught both professionals and the public that medicine was not simply a matter of miraculous cures, but of patient, meticulous work. Hospitals became institutions not through heroic interventions, but through the disciplined repetition of procedures, documentation, and observation. The limitations of mercury were well understood by practitioners, but necessity dictated its continued use. Alternatives were few, and the social pressure to provide treatment for syphilis and other diseases was immense. Physicians accepted the monotony and risk as part of their professional obligation. The tedious repetition of preparation, administration, and recording minimized risk, allowed hospitals to treat larger populations, and provided a framework for understanding the effects of treatment over time. In this way, the dullness of procedure became an advantage. Predictability and consistency allowed hospitals to survive and even expand. Even in peripheral hospitals, far from the centers of European medicine, mercury maintained its central role. Colonial hospitals in the Americas, Africa, and Asia adopted European protocols, relying on trained clerks, apothecaries, and nurses to administer treatments precisely and document outcomes. The repetitive routines, established in Paris, London, or Amsterdam, were transplanted thousands of miles away, demonstrating the portability of institutional knowledge grounded in dull, methodical practice. The global reach of mercury therapy underscores how boring, repetitive procedures can form the backbone of professional standards across cultures and continents. As you imagine the daily rhythm of mercury therapy, the soft scraping of ointment, the clinking of pill containers, the scratching of ink on ledger pages, you begin to recognize the patterns that sustain hospitals. Medicine was not, for the majority of patients and staff, a series of dramatic interventions or life-changing discoveries. It was, more often, the slow accumulation of repetitive acts, measuring, observing, recording, and repeating. It was boring, yes, but it was also necessary. Without these routines, hospitals could not function, and patients would suffer. The dull labor of everyday care ensured the survival of institutions, practitioners, and knowledge itself. And yet, even as systems became more standardized, one unresolved tension persisted. Mercury, essential yet toxic, relied on human diligence to avoid disaster. Clerical errors, miscalculations, or lapses in observation could lead to poisoning or death. Hospitals depended on repetition and careful oversight to mitigate risk, but the danger was ever present. The very stability of the institution rested on monotonous labor, executed flawlessly, day after day, week after week, and year after year. As night falls in the wards, lanterns casting a soft glow over the orderly rows of beds, you might watch nurses finish their rounds. Patients rest under careful observation, while clerks review ledgers, checking for completeness. Apothecaries prepare the next day's supply of mercury, weighing, measuring, and labeling each dose with mechanical precision. The hospital hums quietly with repetition, a rhythm that is almost invisible to outsiders, but essential to survival. In this monotony, medicine evolves, institutions endure, and knowledge accumulates proof that the dullest work often has the most profound consequences. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, mercury had become entrenched as a cornerstone of hospital medicine. Across Europe and in colonial outposts, the routines established centuries earlier remained largely unchanged. Apothecaries prepared mercurial ointments and pills with meticulous care. Clerks recorded each patient interaction, and nurses administered the substance with a rigid, repetitive discipline. Hospitals functioned not through sudden insight or dramatic breakthroughs, but through the daily execution of monotonous, methodical procedures. The dullness of these routines was, paradoxically, the engine of their success. The patients themselves became part of this rhythm. Syphilis sufferers endured weeks or months of mercurial treatment, often experiencing side effects ranging from excessive salivation to neurological tremors. Their bodies were measured against precise schedules. Applications, dosages, and observations repeated day after day. While the treatment could be toxic, it also provided a measure of control over diseases that were otherwise untreatable. Survival in early hospitals was less about miraculous cures than about the consistent, repetitive application of what knowledge existed, with careful attention to detail. In this way, mercury therapy illustrates how methodical monotony can be life-saving. Hospitals depended on the invisible labor of clerks and apothecaries as much as on physicians. Ledgers documented treatment regimens, recording every dose, every reaction, every adjustment. Apothecaries repeated their preparations with unwavering care, ensuring that each batch of ointment or pills met precise standards. The tedious work of cataloguing and verifying, seemingly unremarkable, was essential to maintaining the integrity of medical practice. Without this repetition, mercury's dangers could easily have outweighed its benefits, turning a tool of care into a cause of harm. The survival of hospitals rested on the quiet diligence of countless individuals executing monotonous, repetitive tasks flawlessly. Mercury's dullness also shaped the institutionalization of medicine. Hospitals organized their spaces around treatment schedules and procedural rhythms. Patients were grouped by therapy type, with nurses and physicians following standardized protocols. Clerks maintained inventories and tracked patient progress. The repetition of these routines created predictability. Administrators could anticipate needs. Resources could be allocated efficiently, and physicians could rely on accurate records to refine treatment methods. Over time, these procedural routines became a hallmark of hospital practice, laying the foundation for modern healthcare systems where consistency and documentation are paramount. The risks associated with mercury ensured that meticulous repetition was not optional. It was necessary. Overdose could be fatal. Underdose could allow disease to persist. Mistakes in preparation, measurement, or administration could compromise entire wards. Hospitals developed layers of verification and oversight to mitigate risk. And these bureaucratic safeguards reinforced the importance of repetitive labor. The dull routines of apothecaries, clerks, and nurses were not merely mundane, they were protective mechanisms, ensuring that treatment was effective and survivable for large patient populations. Mercury therapy also influenced the evolution of medical knowledge. By systematically documenting outcomes, hospitals accumulated empirical data on patient responses. Each entry, seemingly trivial, contributed to a larger understanding of therapeutic effects, dosage tolerance, and disease progression. These repetitive observations were among the first steps toward evidence-based practice. Modern medicine's reliance on charts, standardized protocols, and clinical trials can trace part of its lineage back to the monotonous, meticulous record-keeping surrounding mercury in early hospitals. Yet, as effective as these routines were, they reveal a quiet paradox. Medicine relied on a toxic substance administered repetitively to save lives. Its efficacy depended not on brilliance or inspiration, but on ordinary, uncelebrated labor. The rhythm of preparation, measurement, observation, and documentation allowed hospitals to function safely, even with limited knowledge and imperfect tools. The survival of patients, the functioning of institutions, and the accumulation of knowledge were all products of the dull, methodical, and disciplined repetition of daily tasks. Even as other innovations emerged, mercury remained a constant. It was a tool that bridged centuries, shaping hospital procedures, nursing routines, and pharmacological standards. Its influence persisted because it provided a reliable framework for care in an era before modern chemistry and antibiotics. Hospitals were able to scale their operations, treat larger populations, and maintain institutional integrity because repetitive procedures governed both treatment and logistics. The dullness of mercury became, in effect, the engine of continuity and reliability in medical practice. From your perspective, observing the routines of early hospitals, it becomes clear that the story of mercury is not just about a toxic metal. It is about the hidden, repetitive labor that sustains life, the painstaking diligence that allows institutions to function, and the ways in which boring, procedural work underpins survival. It is a reminder that progress often emerges, not from dramatic interventions, but from the quiet, repeated execution of ordinary tasks, sometimes over centuries. When you imagine the Black Death sweeping across Europe in the mid-14th century, vivid images often come to mind. Crowded cities suddenly emptied, bell towers tolling incessantly, streets littered with the sick and dying. But beneath this dramatic narrative lies a more mundane, almost invisible factor that shaped the spread of disease and the lives of those who survived: paper. Ordinary sheets of parchment, letters, and official notices became conduits of both information and contagion. While the story is not sensational, it is chilling in its quiet significance. Imagine a small town in northern Italy. 1348. The plague has arrived on merchant ships traveling from the Mediterranean ports. Local officials, merchants, and families scramble to communicate. Letters are written. Warnings, requests for help, and notifications of deaths. The paper carries inked words, names, addresses, dates, but it also carries fleas and contaminated material. In the dim light of candlelit homes, clerks and scribes inscribe these letters carefully, unaware that the very act of communication may facilitate the spread of disease. The quiet, repetitive labor of copying information, a clerk's monotonous routine, becomes a vector in a catastrophe that kills millions. Communication, even in the middle of a plague, was essential. Cities needed to alert neighbors, merchants needed to settle accounts, and families sought news of distant relatives. Letters were copied multiple times, stored in chests, and transported across trade routes. In this sense, paper functioned as both lifeline and hazard. Its mundane presence, a folded sheet, a carefully sealed envelope, belied its deadly potential. The repetitive act of writing and distributing letters, so ordinary in daily life, took on profound significance during a pandemic. Local governments faced an unprecedented administrative challenge. Officials had to record deaths, isolate households, and communicate restrictions. Orders were written, signed, and dispatched repeatedly across towns and regions. Clerks maintained ledgers documenting who was infected, who had fled, and which households required disinfection or quarantine. The work was tedious, monotonous, and largely invisible. Yet it was essential to the functioning of society during a crisis. Without the careful, repetitive labor of documentation, towns could not manage population movements, ration resources, or enforce isolation effectively. The mechanics of isolation were equally dependent on paper. Quarantine orders were written and distributed, sometimes posted publicly on town gates or delivered door to door. Notices specified the duration of confinement, rules for handling food and waste, and consequences for violations. Each instruction had to be clear, legible, and repeated to ensure compliance. The repetitive process of writing, copying, and posting these orders was dull to the point of monotony, yet it directly influenced survival rates. Paper, in its unremarkable ordinariness, became a tool of public health. Merchants and traders faced their own reliance on paper. Letters of credit, invoices, and contracts had to be maintained even as cities emptied and trade routes were disrupted. Each document was handled carefully, copied, and transported. These administrative routines, repetitive and dull under normal circumstances, took on life or death significance during a plague. A delayed shipment, a misrecorded debt, or lost correspondence could mean famine, financial ruin, or the inability to obtain essential goods. In this way, the banal work of commerce intersected tragically with the biological realities of disease. Paper also mediated human relationships during isolation. Families separated by quarantine relied on letters to maintain contact. These letters, filled with routine updates, instructions, and reassurances, were written and rewritten, copied and transmitted over long distances. Each repetition offered a measure of psychological survival, a sense of connection in a time of profound fear and dislocation. The mundane nature of correspondence, the ink, the folds, the seal became deeply meaningful, providing structure and continuity in an otherwise chaotic world. Even religious institutions relied on the dull work of paper. Monasteries and churches recorded deaths, administered charity, and coordinated burial or sanitation procedures. Clerks transcribed these records with the same painstaking repetition applied to legal or commercial documents. Every entry represented human life. Sometimes a family line, often a community's collective grief. The work was boring, almost mechanical, yet it preserved the memory of lives disrupted or lost, creating an archival trace of one of the most devastating pandemics in history. The danger of paper as a vector was largely invisible. which made it all the more insidious. Contaminated letters could be carried unknowingly from city to city, from household to household, linking distant populations in deadly chains. The repetitive use of parchment, the copying of information, and the circulation of documents all created opportunities for fleas and bacteria to travel far beyond their points of origin. The banal, ordinary act of communication became a mechanism of transmission, quietly reinforcing the spread of disease, even as it sustained social and administrative networks. At the same time, paper enabled communities to maintain some degree of order. Repeated documentation, lists of quarantined houses, and notices of curfews provided a framework within which societies could respond. Clerks, scribes, and officials, engaged in repetitive, invisible labor, formed the backbone of epidemic management. Their work, writing, copying, storing, and distributing information, was dull but indispensable. Without these routines, towns might have descended into chaos, with trade collapsing, food supplies dwindling, and disease spreading even more indiscriminately. Imagine the scene in a town council chamber. Clerks hunched over parchment, copying lists of affected households, tallying numbers of deaths, and drafting notices for distribution. Couriers wait patiently outside to deliver the letters to households, shops, and neighboring towns. The process repeats day after day, hour after hour. To the observer, it might seem tedious, even pointless. But each repetition is a lifeline, a measure of control, and a record that ensures the functioning of society amidst catastrophe. Survival depended on this quiet, unglamorous, repetitive work. And yet, for all its utility, the reliance on paper raised an unsettling question. Could the very instruments of communication and administration that preserved order also amplify danger? The same letters that enabled coordination, informed households, and maintained commerce also carried disease invisibly across towns and trade routes. The mundane, ordinary work of writing, copying, and delivering letters became entangled with the biological realities of contagion, illustrating how the most unremarkable objects can have extraordinary impact. As the Black Death spread across Europe, the reliance on paper became increasingly pronounced. It was not enough simply to recognize that plague had arrived. Towns, cities, and regional authorities had to coordinate responses, enforce quarantine measures, and maintain social and economic structures. Paper became the medium through which these repetitive and dull administrative tasks were carried out, transforming ordinary ink and parchment into instruments of public health. Clerks, scribes, and officials engaged in a seemingly endless cycle of documentation, copying, and distribution, a cycle that, though monotonous, was critical to survival. Consider the quarantines imposed on households or entire districts. Notices specifying isolation periods, rules for delivery of food and medicine, and penalties for non-compliance were written, copied, and posted repeatedly. Clerks produced multiple copies of each notice, ensuring that both local residents and neighboring towns were informed. Couriers carried these letters, sometimes for miles, exposing themselves to risk in the process. The repetitive nature of this work, writing, copying, delivering, verifying, was essential. Without it, quarantines would fail, social order would collapse, and the disease would spread uncontrollably. What seems boring on the surface, the mechanical labor of clerks and scribes, was in fact the backbone of epidemic management. In addition to quarantine notices, paper served as the official record of mortality. Local officials maintained detailed ledgers listing names, ages, occupations, and causes of death when identifiable. Each entry, carefully transcribed, contributed to an emerging understanding of the plague's impact. While these records are now invaluable to historians, at the time, they were routine, tedious work. Clerks had to verify each name, ensure consistency across multiple copies, and keep the ledgers safe from fire, moisture, and mishandling. The survival of administrative knowledge, as well as practical coordination during the epidemic, depended on this dull but crucial labor. Merchants, too, were entangled in the repetitive work of documentation. Letters of credit, invoices, and correspondence had to be maintained, even as cities emptied and trade networks strained under the weight of disease. Every transaction required careful notation, verification, and sometimes repeated copying. The dull work of record-keeping was critical. A misfiled letter or delayed invoice could trigger famine in one city or financial ruin for a trading family. In this way, mundane, repetitive paper labor directly influenced survival, both economically and biologically. Ordinary documents were entwined with extraordinary stakes. Even religious institutions depended on the monotony of paper-based routines. Monasteries, parish offices, and church officials recorded deaths, distributed aid, and coordinated burials. Clerks transcribed these records repeatedly, ensuring that aid was allocated fairly and that burial procedures followed the authorities' directives. These repetitions, dull to the observer, created a rhythm that allowed institutions to function under extreme stress. In a period when social systems could easily collapse, the repetitive labor of writing, copying, and filing letters and ledgers maintained order, conveyed authority, and preserved human life. The repetition extended to daily communication between quarantined households. Families isolated in plague-stricken districts relied on letters for instructions on where to obtain food, how to dispose of waste safely, and how to protect the sick. The process was painstaking. Scribes or household members copied letters carefully, sealed them, and entrusted them to couriers. These letters were often recopied and verified along the route, a dull but vital repetition, ensuring that information remained legible and accurate. In a sense, the very survival of quarantined populations relied on the mundane repetition of correspondence and record-keeping. Paper also shaped patterns of perception and behavior during the epidemic. Public notices informed citizens of risk, restrictions, and responsibilities, creating predictability in a chaotic environment. Repetition of messaging reinforced compliance. Repeated letters, copies, and postings ensured that instructions were understood and internalized. The dull work of clerks, scribes, and couriers, though invisible, generated societal cohesion. Without these repetitive processes, fear, misinformation, and panic might have overridden attempts to contain the disease, and towns would have descended into disorder. Yet paper was not neutral. While it communicated instructions and maintained order, it could also spread the plague itself. Letters and documents carried fleas, contaminated fibers, or particles that allowed bacteria to travel from one household to another. Clerks and couriers unwittingly became vectors, their repetitive handling of documents connecting distant households in chains of transmission. The very object that enabled coordination and survival simultaneously introduced risk. The quiet, mundane labor of documentation was entangled with life and death in a way almost imperceptible to those performing it. The logistical effort of managing paper during the Black Death was staggering. Multiple copies of every notice, ledger, and letter were necessary. Couriers traveled repetitively along familiar routes to distribute documents. Clerks verified entries repeatedly, cross-checking against prior records to avoid errors. Each stage of the process involved monotonous repetition, yet each repetition was essential to the functioning of society under duress. Survival, order, and historical memory depended upon these unremarkable routines. As you imagine this network of dull, repetitive labor, the scratching of quills, the folding of letters, the clinking of wax seals, the soft shuffle of ledgers in dimly lit offices, you begin to appreciate the quiet architecture of epidemic survival. The Black Death did not just reshape Europe through mortality. It reshaped it through communication, documentation, and repetitive labor that maintained coherence in the midst of chaos. The survival of towns, merchants, and families often hinged on the most ordinary, boring acts performed with painstaking diligence. And yet, for all its utility, a quiet tension persists. The very objects that preserved order, letters, ledgers, official notices, also carried danger. Each repeated act of copying, sealing, or delivering had the potential to spread disease invisibly. Clerks, couriers,